Metal screeched against metal. Limbs stretched until they nearly snapped. Then came the awful sound, bones cracking under unbearable tension. Deep in the damp, echoing stone chambers of the Tower of London, a 25-year-old woman had just had her arms and legs broken on the rack, Tudor England's most feared instrument of torture. Her name was Anne Askew, but her story didn't end in that hellish room. 4 months later, on July 16, 1546, Anne was carried, yes, carried, to a public bonfire in Smithfield. She couldn't walk. Her bones had been shattered during interrogation. Her crime? Standing firm in her religious beliefs at a time when faith could be a death sentence. To understand Anne's brutal end, we have to rewind the clock and dive into the religious chaos of 16th century England. By the time Anne came of age, King Henry VIII had already broken from Rome, establishing the Church of England. But it wasn't a clean break. Doctrinally, things were murky. Traditional Catholics clashed with Protestant reformers, and the king himself swayed between factions based on his political needs. It was a time of uncertainty, suspicion, and violence, all in the name of religion. Anne Askew was born in 1521 in Lincolnshire to a minor noble family. That noble status didn't protect her, not in this volatile climate. From an early age, she showed sharp intelligence and an unquenchable hunger for religious knowledge. Most women were discouraged, even forbidden, from studying scripture. Anne devoured it. She read the Bible, theological debates, and religious treatises, challenging traditional beliefs long before it was acceptable for a woman, especially a young woman, to do so. At first, her family admired her intellect, but admiration quickly turned to alarm. Anne had adopted radical Protestant views. Most dangerously, she denied the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation. This was no small thing. The belief that the bread and wine literally become Christ's body and blood during Mass was central to Catholic theology. Anne believed communion was symbolic. That belief alone could get you burned alive. When she was 15, her father arranged a marriage to Thomas Kyme, a staunch Catholic. The expectation was clear: marriage would tame her. It didn't. Anne refused to be silenced or subdued. She left her husband and 2 young children, an act considered outrageous and scandalous in her time, and moved to London. There she joined a circle of outspoken Protestant reformers. She preached. She wrote. She handed out banned Protestant texts. She defied not only religious law, but also gender norms that demanded women keep quiet about theology. Anne refused to be invisible. In 1545, she was arrested for the first time, accused of heresy. Interrogators were stunned by her theological precision. She wasn't simply repeating slogans, she understood doctrine deeply. When they questioned her about the Mass, she responded with the kind of clarity you'd expect from a trained theologian. But her brilliance only made her more dangerous in their eyes. An articulate, educated woman promoting heresy. That was doubly threatening. After several weeks, she was released, but she didn't back down. Anne continued to write and speak out. Her letters from that period, some of which still survive, show a mind as sharp as ever and a faith that only deepened. In one, she famously declared, "I would rather die than live denying Christ." That line wasn't just poetic, it was prophetic. Her growing influence drew the attention of Stephen Gardiner, the powerful Bishop of Winchester. Gardiner was no moderate, he was a zealous Catholic who viewed Protestantism as a disease. He decided Anne had to be silenced permanently. In 1546, she was arrested again. This time, the charges were more serious, denying the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Under Tudor law, that was punishable by death. But first they wanted her to confess and implicate others. This was no longer just about Anne. They wanted names. She was taken to the Tower of London, and what followed was one of the most disturbing episodes of torture ever recorded under Henry VIII's reign. The rack, a brutal device used to dislocate limbs and snap bones, was rarely used on women. But Anne was an exception. On June 29, 1546, she was taken down into the bowels of the tower, into a cold, wet corridor, where the rack stood waiting. Present were 2 infamous figures in Tudor cruelty, Lord Chancellor Thomas Wriothesley and his ally Richard Rich. These were powerful men, and they were personally overseeing the torture of a young woman. That tells you how serious they were about breaking her. Anne was stripped, bound, and tied to the machine. First, they turned the roller, slowly stretching her body gradually. They hoped the fear would break her will. But Anne stayed calm. She whispered psalms as her joints were pulled past their limits. Furious, riotously, and Rich ordered the executioner to tighten the ropes even more. The room echoed with the sound of snapping bones. Anne's arms and legs were shattered. Her body was permanently maimed, yet still she didn't give them the confession they wanted. At one point, the executioner, overcome with pity, refused to continue. In a shocking display of cruelty, Riotously and Rich took matters into their own hands. They personally operated the rack, applying unbearable force until Anne's limbs were completely destroyed. When it was finally over, she had to be carried back to her cell. She couldn't move on her own ever again. Everyone assumed she'd die from her injuries. But she didn't. Anne survived. Over the following weeks, she remained locked in the tower, unable to walk, eat, or dress without help. Yet her spirit stayed unbroken. She wrote letters slowly, painfully, with damaged hands, describing her pain but also her peace. She believed that God had given her strength, even as her body failed. Eventually, she was put on trial. But it wasn't a trial, it was a performance. Anne was carried into the courtroom in a chair. When questioned about her beliefs, she was as defiant as ever. She denied transubstantiation again, and insisted every Christian had the right to read and interpret Scripture themselves. Her voice was clear. Her words, despite the agony, were eloquent. Everyone present was struck by her composure. It made no difference. The sentence was already decided: death by burning. She would be executed at Smithfield, the same place where countless other so-called heretics had died. But Anne's execution would become one of the most memorable of the entire Tudor period. July 16, 1546. The morning was unusually clear in London. Crowds began to gather at Smithfield, the city's most infamous execution ground. People came for many reasons: curiosity, devotion, fear. But that day they would witness something unforgettable. Anne Askew, her limbs shattered, her body broken, was carried in a chair to the site. She couldn't stand. She couldn't even move on her own. Alongside her were three men: John Lascelles, John Adams, and Nicholas Belenian. All had been condemned for heresy, but it was Anne who captured the attention of the crowd. A young noblewoman, brutally tortured, now about to be burned alive for her faith. She wore a simple tunic, no jewelry, no shoes, no cloak, just a plain garment for a final act of defiance, because she wasn't just another heretic to be erased. She was a symbol, a warning, and whether the authorities intended it or not, a martyr. Anne was tied to the stake, not standing, but sitting. Chains were wrapped tightly around her torso to keep her upright. Her body couldn't support itself anymore. The rack had taken care of that. Her legs dangled uselessly. Her arms, once strong enough to turn pages of Scripture, to write her bold letters, hung limp at her sides. And yet, even then, even as smoke began to curl from the wood at her feet, she spoke. Eyewitnesses, most of them Protestant sympathizers, claimed her voice rose above the murmuring crowd. She recited prayers. She affirmed her faith. She asked for forgiveness, not for herself, but for those who had condemned her. The crowd stood in stunned silence. This wasn't a raving radical. This wasn't the wild-eyed heretic the church had painted her to be. This was a composed, intelligent woman facing one of the most excruciating deaths imaginable with grace. And then the fire came. At first the smoke, then the flickers of flame crawling up the stake, licking at her clothes. Because she couldn't move, she couldn't turn or flinch as most others might have done. Her injuries from the rack had left her utterly defenseless. She could only sit there, still, as the flames consumed her. But even then, witnesses swore her lips moved in prayer. She didn't scream. She didn't curse. Her eyes stayed open. By the time her body had turned to ash, Anne Askew had become something more than a victim. She was a message, a challenge, a spiritual giant who had dared to question religious authority and paid for it with her life. Her death sent shockwaves across England and far beyond. In a time when executions were routine and cruelty was part of politics, Anne's case stood out. Even hardened spectators used to burnings, beheadings, hangings were deeply shaken. The fact that the government had tortured a young noblewoman on the rack, then burned her in public, horrified people at every level of society. Anne's letters, smuggled out of prison by sympathetic friends, began to circulate in secret. They made their way into Protestant circles across Europe. In those pages, Anne described not only the unbearable physical pain, but also her inner calm, her unwavering conviction that she was right in the eyes of God. One passage in particular struck a chord. "My body may be broken, but my soul remains intact before God." That line would be repeated for decades, whispered in secret prayer meetings, quoted by reformers, scribbled in the margins of outlawed Protestant books, and in England, the political consequences were immediate. The use of the rack on a woman of noble blood sparked outrage. Even some members of King Henry VIII's court, staunch supporters of the monarch, were disturbed. The aristocracy began to murmur. If someone like Anne Askew, educated and born into a respected family, could be tortured until her bones broke, who among them was truly safe? For many, her treatment crossed a line. And behind closed doors, the divisions within the court deepened. On one side, hardline conservatives like Bishop Gardiner celebrated Anne's death as a triumph and necessary purge of heresy. But on the other side were moderate reformers, horrified by what they'd witnessed. Catherine Parr, Henry's sixth and final wife, was among them. Though outwardly loyal to the king's religious reforms, she was known to hold secret Protestant sympathies. The execution of Anne Askew likely terrified her. It sent a clear message: no one, not even women close to the throne, was safe. Historians believe this event served as a warning to all those at court who leaned even slightly toward reform. After Anne's execution, many grew silent, careful, calculated. Her death chilled the air around the Protestant movement within the court. And yet, despite the crown's efforts to suppress her memory, Anne refused to disappear from history. Her execution at Smithfield became the stuff of legend. The image of a broken young woman tied to a stake and calmly praying as flames engulfed her haunted the English imagination. Chroniclers wrote down witness accounts. Poets referenced her in verse. Her writings continued to circulate underground. One executioner, possibly the same man who had refused to keep turning the rack, reportedly said he had never seen such composure in the face of death. Others present were said to have turned away, weeping. Even hardened officials couldn't deny that something extraordinary had happened at Smithfield that day. And in the decades that followed, Anne Askew's reputation only grew. When Elizabeth, the first daughter of Anne Boleyn, and herself a Protestant queen, took the throne, England shifted again. The Church of England became more firmly rooted in Protestant doctrine, and with that change came a re-evaluation of the past. Anne Askew, once condemned as a heretic, was posthumously honored as a martyr. Her writings, once outlawed, were published and studied. Her name appeared in Protestant texts across Europe as a symbol of courage and unwavering faith. In seminaries and underground congregations alike, Anne became a spiritual role model, proof that even the most brutal tortures couldn't destroy true conviction. She wasn't just remembered as a victim. She was remembered as a warrior of faith. And more than that, Anne Askew's story became a turning point in the wider struggle for religious freedom and for women's voices in religion. Because Anne hadn't just challenged the church. She had challenged an entire system that told women to stay silent, submissive, and uninformed. She spoke with authority. She wrote with clarity. And she refused to be silenced, even by unimaginable pain. Her legacy echoed not only through religious circles but also through movements for women's rights and spiritual autonomy. Hundreds of years later, her words still resonate. Anne's life and death reminds us that real courage doesn't always look like a warrior on a battlefield. Sometimes it's a woman in chains, whispering prayers through pain, choosing to stand by her truth, even when she can no longer stand at all.